So in the background of the general crisis, which is the health crisis, and the particular crisis of capitalism and its particular manifestations on the field, we do know intuitively and by looking around us that the worst hit from the COVID-19 pandemic were the marginalized. And so through this talk, what I'm trying to address is that how do we diagnose the present predicament, which is a universally shared predicament, and how do we channelize the discontents that people are facing across the globe. uh, Giorgio Agamben's interventions, however pertinent, actually led me to ask whether he was trying to steer us away from class struggle, or whether his analysis was kind of, pushing us towards class struggle. So we also know that there have been a lot of conspiracy theories around, capitalism, that, Bill Gates is the one who is now emblematic of monopoly capitalism. So there has been this kind of a desire to, use conspiracy theories as a symbolic glue, uh, to kind of justify the status quo, or maybe to kind of, bolster a political defeatism or a revolutionary optimism, which is actually quite foundationless. And I do understand that at this point, when there has been a resurgence of right wing forces across the universe, across the globe at least, uh, and the left wing forces are nowhere to be seen, even though there are, strikes that are being organized here and there. And particularly if you look at the African countries, we do see that, all of Haiti has been protesting for the last 1 year. And it is particularly against the kind of humanitarian aid, or, the kind of NGO policies that have become, in a way, it is capitalism which is trying to address its own crises by plugging in more money and by pushing new imperial policies. And we see that manifestation even in the vaccine policies, where at least 81% of the vaccines were preserved for the global north, and the rest of, like, which is 0.3%, was reserved for the global south. And the global south, of course, is no monolith. Every country has its own underclass, and that is what becomes the universal for Marxian politics, the proletarian forces. uh, so I would be questioning Agamben on through this paper, and also challenging biopolitics as a framework to address uh, the contemporary crisis. So I'm just going to read the paper now. Uh, Today, in the time of COVID-19 pandemic, it appears that we're all outlawed until we become legible and legitimate subjects again. So much so that states have started considering providing immunity certificates, contact tracing facilities, centralizing all information about social interactions and our data activities, having technologically enabled public screening mechanisms, and putting in place digital warning systems to guide and mediate people's everyday relations. So we all know about the green card, which is that, you won't be permitted to travel, you won't even be able to, access public spaces in the same way as we could have before the pandemic. And that has actually led to a lot of uproar, with especially amongst the far right forces in America and elsewhere, where people have been intuitively protesting against masks and against vaccines and against these kind of biosecurity norms that are being instituted. So along with this, we find that there are indemnity bonds, vaccine patents, coercive liberalization, emergency licensing, humanitarian aids and loans, and intellectual property laws, which have been fueling the research and development that would fight the pandemic with capital's might and law's force. So we particularly face the repercussions of such policies in the global south, because a lot of the vaccine licenses were just delivered under the emergency laws, so they didn't really have to go through the norms uh, which are regularly required for them to get licenses. It was made very, very easy for people to uh, outsource their vaccines. More than 81% of the vaccines were given in middle and higher income countries, and only 0.3% vaccines were given to low income countries, where Bill Gates plugged in with his benevolent capitalism. I would recommend Michelle Greenstein and Jeremy Lofredo's report, Why Bill Gates' Global Health Empire Promises More Empire and Less Public Health, for anybody who's interested in, further reading on this. Uh, they highlight how Bill Gates has stakes in research and production in competing pharma companies and is an active lobby for certification in the WHO, and has his tentacles in the NGO and development sector, which is responsible for the distribution of vaccine and is able to influence global health policy and national laws in his favor. But as I said again, do we make Bill Gates some kind of an evil force who's, just not a symptom of capitalism and not emblematic of capitalism? Or do we see him as an exception, or do we see him as a symptom of capitalism? That is where I would differ from Agamben, and we'll find that later. This has led some well-meaning people into taking dangerous anti-vaccines positions, especially because the entire debate seems to be polarized between free choice and coercive vaccination. So the idea of compulsory vaccination seems to have completely disappeared from the scene, and one does not realize that that it obscures the fact that if half the population is unvaccinated, then they are at a greater risk of contacting the mutant virus. So we need compulsory vaccination once you've already had a vaccination drive and only covered less than half the population, because the virus will mutate. uh, and of course we know that how these vaccination tests are conducted. It's mostly conducted in the tribal belts of Chota Nagpur plateau in India, and many women organizations like Saheli have actually worked on it, and highlighted the fact that these vaccination, I mean, basically they're using people from the global south as some kind of a guinea pig for their experimentation, and that has been raised many times. But be that as it may, while many have articulated these fears of a dystopian future of machinic enslavement and authoritarianism, what they fail to reckon with is that the processes of data capitalism also require electricity. And given that there is an energy and ecological crisis that we are faced with, it is logical that we should see ourselves as part of and living through yet another crisis. And there is much talk about COP26, etc. So we know that we are really in the midst of also withering away of natural resources, which cannot generate surplus value by itself. So it's only logical that we do not see capitalism as this relentless force which can just self expand infinitely, but rather see this crisis to also be a crisis of capitalism, which is why there are tendencies of monopolization, which is why there is a resource crunch, and there is a certain kind of desperation even amidst the ruling classes and the political classes. Therefore, capitalism is a system of compounding crises, or a system which produces crisis within a crisis to overcome its own limitations. It is here where we need to pay attention to the internal contradictions in capital and its self-imploding tendencies. Capitalism is making human conditions perilous for a majority of people in the process of its own perish. And I'm no specialist, but as I understand it, the COVID-19 belongs to a family of coronavirus, which is basically something that we've seen in MERS. We've also seen it, the variations of the coronavirus across history. So the virus gets activated upon human animal contact, and it is a it is a familiar pedigree, but still new. It is no longer the same virus that we had known before. Like I said, SARS and MERS were variations of the COVID-19 phenomenon. Zoonotic virus is alive amidst us, growing and mutating as we speak. The novelty of the virus is that it's an advanced version of the older form, and it has no vaccine to cure it. Even though the conspicuous absence of a vaccine points towards the pharmaceutical cartel, which we will not be able to discuss here. But I would recommend Robert Wallace's Big Farms Make Big Flu for anybody who's interested in further reading. And also Andrew Liu's Chinese Virus World Market, which basically points to the fact that, I mean, when the pandemic broke out, there were all of these, even Trump had said that this is Chinese virus. And there was a global consensus that China is kind of conspiring against the rest of the world. And but so what Andrew Liu's article actually talks about is that who are the people who have stakes in Wuhan. Mostly we'll find, and we'll be able to, if we follow the money, we'll be able to trace it back to American companies. So it's no longer just China and Wuhan as a site that we can easily render as the other. So Andrew Liu's article points out how the viral phenomena of the pandemic is not a purely biological force. That is, it is not a natural calamity which is totally divorced from social practices. While it is easier to discern the social effects of the virus in its grotesque manifestations, as in its differential impact on people across classes, its racialized iterations, which were hinged on profiling China and its people as the genus and the locus of the disease. Many people from northeast of India were racially attacked, and the virus soon became a metaphor for otherness when Muslim people in India were viciously attacked as likely carriers and intentional spreaders of the virus. And one can read Hanan Zafar and Shaheen Abdullah's piece on this. It is far more challenging to see the pandemic as an effect of the same social relations which it is corroding. This human animal contact, rather, represents a vortex of relations mediated by labor, production processes, conditions of production, and chains of distribution. And Mike Davis, in his Capitalism is the Disease and the Monster Enters, actually talks about that. Davis focuses on the livestock revolution, ongoing industrialization, urbanization, and the absence of both intra and interstate coordination and planning in the face of intensifying globalization, all of which owe in many ways to the capitalist mode of production. One way of understanding the virus is that we accept it as a natural force because it is something that we need to reckon with. It is not purely biological and neither is it purely a social construct. It is through the dialectic of labor, capital relations, and its interaction with nature that you know, that the virus does get activated with its own internal dynamics at a molecular level, and yet hold the process of its coming into contact with humans to assume another life as a concrete abstraction. Much has been said about the conditions of the virus's breeding and the network of global relations of capital it travels through to assume the shape of a pandemic. And a lot of people said that, that the pandemic is created by capitalism, whereas the virus in itself is something that cannot be helped. Along the way, the virus remains a live subject, fighting against its own internal contradictions to mutate and adapt to new conditions. As Robert Esposito says, the conditions of immunity have been replaced with that of immunization, raising concerns about imagining a cure or an antidote that will serve an end to the problem, not implicated within the logic of capital. So Esposito also belongs to the biopolitical school of thought, and he does accept that that there is a certain process of immunization and normalization of biosecurity mechanisms to address uh, the pandemic. There is no panacea for the virus, as there isn't one for the political condition that we have now come to inhabit. The crisis is no longer imminent, but we are part of the compounding crisis, and we're living through that history. So it's not a dystopian future that we should be worried about. It's in fact the present which is dystopian. My paper explores Agamben's bewildering courage to address the suddenness of the loss of sociality imposed by the preventive protocols that mandate physical distancing, which exacerbate the conditions of grief, anxiety induced by the near total absence of state intervention to mitigate the crisis. Perhaps to a Western audience, this might seem paradoxical since the state, since its neoliberal retreat, seems to have been most active during the pandemic. However, in the Indian context, it is the state which has functioned through its absence more than an active intervention in the social governance of the pandemic. India was one of the countries to have imposed recurring lockdowns and really severe ones, but along with that, the social welfare system was not capacitated to mitigate the effects of the lockdown, thus resulting in overwhelming loss of life. The indiscriminate force of the virus was nonetheless born discriminately. And we've had to see really horrifying footages of people, basically dead bodies floating on rivers, and the entire thing has been extremely traumatic for a society as a whole. Although universally governed by the logic of separation of healthy from unhealthy bodies, there are no uniform effects of such biopolitics. If biopolitics is understood as not just sovereign right to decide death, but to animate life such that death is an ever present and imminent possibility, it is, of course, the excluded bodies that constitute the center of the system and on whom the law functions most severely through a relation of abandonment. Esposito writes, giving doctors the task of political decision making on the one hand strongly reduces the scope for political action, and on the other hand, radically transforms the political arena, making deviance a pathological condition. And as you can see on the slide, uh, basically the primary contradiction in biopolitics seems to be modernity versus this idea of a universal pre ideological whole, which is represented in humanity, or as a race we are unified by birth. So their primary contradiction seems to be science, modern science versus politics, where science serves as a tool for governing the political and thereby starts to define life in its shape. uh, and of course it's very tempting because this framework does capture what we are going through, right? Where technology and medicine is literally animating our life and mediating all kinds of social relations and restrictions that are imposed upon us. But through the paper, I will try to maybe convince you otherwise that a Marxist materialist analysis of social contradictions does not simply subsume status violence, or does not assume status violence to be the sole representation of the violence that is endemic to the social structure. But state violence actually and unequally reflects the violence which is already kind of permeated and diffused in the social system, which is, which divides society along class relations. In India, with 93% of the total workforce in the country being in the informal sector, economists had anticipated a crisis of unprecedented scale. 800 million people who were promised 5 kg of grain in April, May, and June of 2020, we actually found that only 200 million people didn't receive any ration for those months. As of May 2020, uh, 383 people had died under the punitive lockdown. To worsen the grief of loss, the government of India went ahead and plainly refused to acknowledge the loss of life in a bid to evade all responsibility and accountability towards people. So a lot of, we had seen distress migration in India where migrants were basically traveling back to their hometowns. And a lot of them, at least 700 of them, had died either out of fatigue, exhaustion, or the fact that they didn't have anything to eat. And this is something which was not even recorded by the government, and therefore the government takes no responsibility. Ever since the lockdown was imposed in India, the worst hit have been those who are working in the cities far from their hometowns, most of whom have been denied the right to return to their homes because the economy needed to be rebuilt on the broken backs of the workers who had been thrown into a field of insecure working conditions. And this is, mind you, during the lockdown where everybody was asked not to move around, not to participate, not to, go to their jobs or their workstations. But the workers, of course, were an exception. Workers in India were locked out as the city observed a lockdown. Staying at home had become a patriotic gesture against the movement of abandoned workers who were falling off the frames of the nation as wartime casualties, battling to perform the labor of being cogs in the wheels of capital with their own life. The corona crisis has further deepened and exacerbated the already existing crisis in Indian society, which is along caste, class, and gender lines. Despite the many protests being staged by migrant workers, the government belatedly responded to the situation by making emergency provisions, giving them a small window to squeeze themselves home or remain where they are with the abysmal wages that they had. With the state using the police to persuade workers, workers remained tied to the cities despite their own deprivation. thus laying bare the relations of production and presupposed social distance as included exclusion of the underclass on which society rests. Today, it is clear that despite the calls for physical distance, self enclosure of social life is not possible without someone having to disproportionately risk their lives to ensure that basic functions of having running water supply, food, electricity, sanitation are met. Society was forced to reckon with this, with its own dependence on the underbelly, with which a constant and deep contact is maintained despite and through the mediated relations of untouch. And this is particularly true for Indian society, where most of the work is distributed along caste lines. It was as if the margins had engulfed the metropole through the generalization of the fate which was hitherto reserved for the masses. Many frontline workers and wage laborers confronted the stigma of being seen as potential carriers while being pushed into precarity and deprivation. That is symptomatic of institutionalized caste order, class antagonism, police brutality, leaving the underclass with no option but to persist or perish under the conditions of panic and precarity. In fact, before Giorgio Gambin had published his ruminations, Italy had seen a protest by factory workers who were surreptitiously being forced to labor in insecure working conditions during the severe lockdown. So, a similar situation uh, was unfolding in Italy as a Gambin writes, and I think this is important to know where he's coming from. And of course, Italy had a very, very severe lockdown, so one can understand the anxiety with which a Gambin is writing, and I fully sympathize with him. In regulating the movement of people, the state was simultaneously able to dictate the unregulated forced extraction of labor. In juxtaposition, according to BBC, as of July 2021, Apple's profits nearly doubled to $21.7 billion in the 3 months to June 30th as customers bought pricier 5G iPhones. Microsoft similarly saw a boom in its uh, sales, which was up by 47% due to the demand for cloud services and games. Google's parent company Alphabet also reported that their quarterly sales and profits had surged to record highs. The coincidence of super profits and accompanying systematic doom is not a coincidence at all. It is rather the most naked manifestation of the crisis that is endemic to the capitalist system. The struggle between survival of humans and capitalism is systematically framed in antagonistic terms between labor and capital, life and freedom, survival and struggle, and therefore the contradictory reality of prosperity upon a few against a majority is capital's logical manifestation and not an anomaly. So it is no accident that while the ruling classes brace themselves to sacrifice their lives on doomsday surfing on the screen, there is a perverse enjoyment it derives in overlooking the reality of misery of those who struggle to survive under prevalent conditions. In fact, Marx's idea of commodity fetishism illustrates that labor power is a commodity which its possessor, the wage worker, sells to capitalists out of systemic compulsion. For Marx, the commodity form of productive relations is a fetish because socially necessary labor power that produces it becomes objectified in it, lost in this fetishism in which alienated life form emerges. In other words, why does the worker labor to reproduce the structures of its own exploitation? It is in order to live. It is in order to survive the systemic oppression. So global economic relations are thus animated by this constitutive unfreedom to opt out of the system which has subsumed social relations according to itself, with value being determined in relation to capital. Survival thus is implicated in an immanent logic of extraction and exploitation, which counterposes life and liberty. Therefore, it's when I say that we are revisiting security, it comes from this understanding that life and liberty are constitutively counterposed in capitalist societies. Therefore, for Marx, the very contradiction that makes capitalism a force to reckon with and fight is that it undermines life by co-opting the sphere of living itself in relation to capital. As Marx explained, in relation to the crisis of 19th century, those contradictions lead to explosions, crises, in which momentary suspension of all labor and annihilation of the greater part of capital violently lead it back to the point where it is enabled to go on fully employing its reproductive powers without committing suicide. Yet, these regularly recurring catastrophes lead to their repetition on a higher scale and finally to its final overthrow. So, here, what Marx is essentially saying is that capitalism does have a self revolutionizing capacity, which Slavoj Žižek also talks about. And it continually renders crises and also deploys means of overcoming it, which is why when we say that capitalism has changed its form across history from financial capitalism to data capitalism, etc., we see a transition in capitalism also, which is capitalism trying to overcome its own limitations because it is met with its own crisis. And 2008 in America, when the banking system had collapsed, was one such manifestation of its crisis. The fantasy of end times and failed calls for action are now animated by highs and lows of the virus's graph. The relative respite that comes from our distance from the waves of coronavirus allows us to reflect on our shared predicament of imminent loss. On the one hand, we seem to have given into the cataclysmic fate of humankind as the great equalizer, where I mean, particularly on Twitter, there were a lot of these memes which were like ironic posts only, but which were basically signaling the virus to be this great leveler. And there was some kind of a strange appreciation of the virus to have finally leveled the playing field. And especially when the right-wing ministers were catching it, then people were quite happy. So resonant in the idea of the virus being an indiscriminate force which reminds us of our shared precarity as humans. We'd rather believe the climate crisis is a conspiracy of elites to sell green capitalism, a hoax to conceal reality of imminent and everyday catastrophes, some kind of divine violence, emancipation of Earth from evil humankind, poetic justice, and inevitable tragedy to come. These are the ways in which we have rationalized the climate crisis, the health crisis, to somewhat reconcile our reality to what appears to be our fate. The catastrophe is not yet to come, but rather we are living through compounding crises as we are being tempted to give in to the fantasy of end of the world. We're in the midst of recurring crises, in disbelief, in shock, in permanent grief, in perennial loss, in denial, in ironic jubilation, in nihilistic appreciation. Without the will to power, with neither the persuasion nor the persistence to risk not knowing the consequences of our failures. And this is why we're having this talk, I guess. Uh, to make things worse, the solution of the problems of climate and energy crises and economic crises have been monopolized by the forces of its own creation, which is global techno-philanthro-capitalists and big pharmaceuticals who act in collusion with nation states to bolster tech-based security solutions to tackle the worldwide crisis of capitalism. We're not uneducated about these facts, yet our knowledge about the system's self-imploding drive does not seem to be fueling the desired change that it needs to restructure the social order. What is markedly different about this moment is the turn towards modern monopoly capitalism with cascading planetary ramifications. Already, we find the World Bank, WHO in the US are backing ideas of launching One Health, One World project, which privatizes the stopgap strategies that would fight zoonotic diseases and ecological crisis by combining agri-business interests with data companies and petropharmaceuticals towards building a comprehensive immunization machinery. The normalization of the crisis is not something I wish to challenge or underestimate through this piece. I simply wish to point at the inadequacy of merely acknowledging the crisis as paving way for its own revolutionary alternative. And a lot of people actually was suggesting that, just because capitalism is fated to its own defeat, it'll happen without politically subjective forces risking their lives, or actually doing anything political. It's not just going to, it's not this accelerationist dream where you reach a certain point in capitalism beyond which it'll fail. One has to keep alive political subjectivity, which was very, very crucial even to Marx. In fact, he's somebody who does put subjectivity within the framework of political economy, and he was probably the first one to do that. Human society, ever since the origin of private property and classes, has moved forward only through a process of prolonged and torturous struggles and by countering the violence of the ruling classes. So it's not just going to, self implode, as it were. Uh, People across the political spectrum are invested in emphasizing the COVID-19 pandemic as a logical outcome of human transgressions and systemic excesses of capitalism. The many ways of analyzing a profoundly disorienting present range from seeing the pandemic as a crisis of the Anthropocene, a logical outcome of unrelenting expansion of neoliberal privatization, which could have been anticipated but not prevented, save for being deferred or delayed. This is something that Ashish Kotari writes. Then the second one is Agamben's understanding, which is that which sees the pandemic as a natural progression of an objective historical repetition of the originary and constitutive violence of political life, which he identifies as the originary biopolitical moment in history, the discrimination of human life entering polity is the originary biopolitical moment for Agamben. Or the third kind of response, which has been very famous, is seeing the pandemic as a necessary shock to repeat cyclical disasters accrued by capitalism, which is Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. We see that our philosophers are oscillating between two conceptual landscapes. One is dealing with immediate questions of security and autonomy, which is largely a function of governance, disciplinarity, juridical legalism, carcerality, and repression. And two, trying to reimagine the relation between life and freedom, going beyond and against the immediate conditions of possibility. With people warning each other against the sterility of ideas, cultural stagnation, and economic precarity, the objective crisis has to be seen as corresponding to the subjective breakdown of human bonds, liberties, and value systems. The wider cultural shift, unfortunately, is not being seen as constitutively correlational to the reconstitution of global economy and the reconfiguration of social classes. Lack of healthcare, lack of employment opportunities, lack of guarantee of minimum support for subsistence, economic precarity has led uh, the state to assume a certain kind of centrality in socio-economic life. The capitalist state is both mitigating the effects of capitalism's destruction while also ensuring laboring potential towards capital with a repressive force, which it does by policing, enforcing severe lockdowns, through data surveillance. And why does it do that? It's also, of course, one is to contain the spread of the virus, but it is also in order to suppress the real emergency, which is the revolt, the uprisings, the strikes, and a potential um, revolutionary conditions from precipitating, which is where Agamben actually comes from. He does identify that the repressive force of the state is primarily to contain people's anger. The state, thus, is simultaneously facilitating reterritorialization of global supply chains, shift in mode of capitalist production, and reconstituting class formations. And we do see a trend of pauperization of the masses, especially through the farm bills that were introduced in India. We do see this anxiety in the hitherto rich feudal classes who are now realizing that they might actually become working class after these neo-imperial policies have been pushed through during the lockdown. The struggle between survival of humans and capitalism is systematically framed in antagonistic terms, and therefore the internal contradiction of prosperity of a few against a majority is capital's logical manifestation, as I had said before. Agamben wants us to salvage biological life from biotechnological surveillance apparatus, vitalism, and therefore proposes no study of contradictions and antagonisms in society which have exacerbated the conditions of the pandemic. He articulates a universal helplessness in the face of a time when death stalks life. He sees the pandemic as a paradigmatic shift which is taking a biosecurity turn. He understands the historical juncture as one in which an entire civilization and human race is thrown into a crisis of symbols by producing simultaneous fear and fascination for protection, therefore leading people to wish to be both included in the logic of the system as well as being exempted from it. The pandemic is the perfect situation to see this contradiction unfold, where the immunization for the coronavirus through agropharma technologies, uh, technological solutions, is at the same time a dreaded social phenomena which can potentially produce unforeseeable effects on an entire form of human life. Agamben, despite his observation of the crisis, offers a myopic alternative politics, save for a notional one of a non historical exit. So now I'm going to turn to Agamben, and I'm sorry if I've eaten up a lot of your time. Uh, Giorgio Agamben writes, "Man has been abolished in the name of life, then life will be abolished. The truth has been abolished in the name of information, but information will not be abolished. Constitution was abolished in the name of the emergency, but the emergency will not be abolished." And so, of course, this fear that, the emergency actually paves way for a permanent state of emergency. And this is true. I mean, there is no going back to pre pandemic days, which one can also tell intuitively. Uh, Agamben identifies the violence of biopolitics in the forcible abandonment of the ill by the state and its simultaneous policing and virtual ban on the processes of human activities such as collective mourning of death. His intervention is important insofar as the law employs the exception, that is, the suspension of law itself as its original means of referring to and encompassing life, than a theory of the state of exception is the preliminary condition for any definition of the relation that binds and at the same time abandons living beings to the law. According to Agamben, Homo sacer is the original structure in which law encompasses living beings by means of its own suspension. So basically, Agamben's theory of state of exception talks about how the original function of sovereignty is its logic. The very logic of the law contains its internal negation, which is that, just by being included within the logic of the law, you are automatically excluded unless you are uh, deemed a legitimate subject. So every one of us is potentially Homo sacer, and that is his theory. So that is, the production of bare life is already inscribed in the very logic of political life, and therefore those exceptions and anomalies to law are already accounted for in the internal contradiction. Agamben has based his understanding of production of Homo sacer as a sovereign function of biopolitics, where the modern state insists on the very right to hold each life sacred and worthy of a right to life. This legal guarantee then paradoxically and constitutively holds the sovereign's capacity to kill with impunity as its underside. So he does talk about how the Homo sacer, the figure of the Homo sacer, is somebody who can be killable, but not punishable by law, because you kind of reach a cusp where you are outside the domain of law, say, when you're rendered stateless. You're neither a subject of the law nor a subject of a sacred figure. You can be killed without any juridical legal uh, repercussions. So, thus, the very potential of law suspension and negation is internally inscribed in its logic, and therefore the state of exception is the horizon which simultaneously persists with and eventually engulfs the norm, thus rendering the political field into a permanent state of exception. And of course, Agamben is very critical of the human rights discourse because he understands that there's a little bit of mischief in the fact that once you've rendered somebody sacred, you can still go ahead and kill them. Uh, and yeah, I mean, that's precisely what it is. State is the one which destitutes citizen subjects by holding the power and with the lure of cure, thus governing society by monopolizing life through imminent death. Agamben writes, in a perverse, vicious cycle, the limitation of freedom imposed by governments is accepted in the name of desire for safety, which has been created by the same governments who now intervene to satisfy it. In the light of the pandemic, the supranational forces, in collusion with the nation states, delegate their power to create and manage health emergencies, thus creating translocal spheres of indistinction where the functions of life, biomedicine, and politics are blurred. Anyone familiar with his work knows that in Agamben's thought, the political realm is originally biopolitical. So it is unsurprising to hear him repeat the virus could serve as a pretext to close in on the gap between the exception and the norm, as it is predisposed for sovereign power to produce bare life in his framework. In doing so, Agamben is flagging this as an emergent future that is not a distant reality, uh, representing something but rather it represents something that is already in motion, that's always already imminent. A movement towards bare life mediated by greater state surveillance is something that we are reckoning with during the pandemic. This imminent exception manifests in the form of transformed global database security economy. In Gambin, if we search for answers to settle political contradictions in society, we will search in vain. On the contrary, what is needed is to extend the conceptual categories that resonate widely: zone of indistinction, state of exception, notion of bare life. So what he says is that, if once you're relegated, once you're de-recognized by law, that does not mean that the law stops functioning on you. In fact, it functions on you even more severely through a relation of ban, through a relation of abandonment. And that is what is the internal contradiction and constitutive violence of juridicity as such, which is why he kind of identifies the idea of the Zoe as being, you know, mere life, and then there is the bios, which is the political life, which marks the originary discriminatory movement where human life was already splintered to create political life. uh, Therefore, when I say the conversation on Agamben needs to be reopened, I mean that we need not entirely dismiss his observations while correctly faulting him for his diagnosis, which seeks closure in an ontological paradigm of sovereign power that traces itself to a mythical and originary biopolitical instance. By engaging with the work of Agamben, I'm not looking at reconciling my politics with his framework. Rather, by locating and mapping his observations on the crisis, we are better equipped to not repeat, generalize, and apply his concepts to our context, as has been the temptation. So ever since Agamben's state of exception had come, it had become very fashionable to kind of deploy it in every instance. And his understanding, of course, is that, the state of exception basically replicates the camp. And maybe I should just read it instead. In fact, the question that I want to ask is, why have communist revolutionaries been so enamored of the state of exception, even when his conceptualizations have slipped seamlessly into the traditionalism and anti modernity of a populist, vitalist discourse, almost a reactionary kind of populism, a space that is always and ultimately dominated by the reactionary right wing forces? And so there have been a lot of resonances between Agamben's anti-mask, anti-vaccine positions and, the far right. So, and one needs to, of course, read his theory, generously, and also identify this not as a lapse or an appropriation by the right wing, but see this as a problem in the very edifice of his philosophical understanding. Agamben resorts to a kind of structural metaphysics of sovereign power and bare life from the time of his great work, Homo Sacer, which almost seamlessly expresses itself in the philosopher's repudiation of the state's sovereignist violence in its latest incarnation during the pandemic. So, the specificity of the social contradictions that characterize the present terrain of global capitalism, as they're experienced by different nations and people today, is subsumed by the same metaphysics of sovereign violence that Agamben started out with in the earliest phase of neoliberal capitalism in the 1980s and 90s, which phase was itself subsumed by Agamben under a more general and, so to speak, paradigmatic category of the authoritarian state, the limit experience of whose violence was localized in the Nazi camps of 1930s and 1940s in Europe, with the concentration camp thus representing the nomos of modernity or the norm of modernity. Um, Gambin sees the pandemic as creating a sphere of indistinction in which any and all states of sociality, life, and being could be rendered bare through the logic of emergency. According to Gambin in 2014, power today has no form of legitimation other than emergency. It endlessly refers to it and secretly works to produce it uh, as a system that can now only function on the basis of an emergency is also interested in maintaining it at any price. Uh, so, of course, he's suggesting that political life is can only function on the basis of a permanent state of emergency. Further, he says it is not necessary to have a great legal education to appreciate that, from the point of view of the suspension of constitutional guarantees, the only relevant one, there is no difference between two states, the state of exception and the state of emergency. Which is that the camp is now basically the norm and no longer the exception. And the exception, of course, according to Agamben, does work towards becoming the norm, which maybe in the pandemic he sees as already have happened. The function of biotechnological interventions mediate social relations, produce new terms of carcerality, and renders everyone as a potential threat, directly reducible to new modes of intensification of authoritarianism through the very creations of zones of indistinction, where life is sequestered between outright statelessness and rightlessness, and the state of bearing rights without being able to actualize it. Agamben's theoretical engagements talk about the ontological impasse of political life. So, how is this moment in history any different from any other historical moment? Or is the pandemic the most recent example or instantiation of permanent state of exception, which is caused by the originally biopolitical move of discriminating against human life to form political life? Agamben presumes the epitome of freedom as the highest point of authoritarianism, where a security state thwarts all social interaction, exchange, and movement. However, it is not just state violence that people face in our class society. There are, of course, unindexed death, which is what constitutes the norm of capitalist society. Whether you're a worker working in a factory and you die on the job, or you die out of starvation, homelessness, or poverty. These are all these are all examples of unindexed death under capitalism. In contradistinction, through a Marxist lens, a regression into direct forms of control is not the only way through which state organizes social life. Rather, it is through the creation of a sphere of self-mediating institutions, rituals, public events, and celebrations that the state is able to create willful subjects that are authorized by and authorize its rule. Total repression of society is a modality of subjection and exploitation and not a structural necessity, since exploitation, expropriation, and violence is inscribed in the logic of capitalism. Brian Doniger writes, in The Birth of Biopolitics, Foucault provides a rich historical study of how biopolitics was legitimized via free, rational, and collective decision making. Doniger evokes Foucault to mark the difference between anatomopolitics and biopolitics, to remind us that biopolitics doesn't describe techniques that discipline an individual, but techniques that secure the health of a race or species. So there were iterations that we can democratize biopolitics, and it is in response to that Doniger is making this comment that biopolitics is always already democratic. In fact, it actually structures the coordinates of democratic thinking and democratic associations. Red herrings, denial, and negation are governing the state's response to the pandemic, along with measures of tightened security regimes that are no longer carried out in the name of nation state, but in the cause of public health. Secularized in its definition, the claim of sovereignty is no longer limited to the nation state, but an indeterminate ontological situation which demands and necessitates non-human intervention. So this is basically how the state has been handling the emergency. Therefore, the appeal to the general presupposed political subject as a pre-existing collective human race is the function of biopolitics and not revolutionary struggle, which retroactively constructs its agents of political change through a shared ideology. We can only perceive the essential dimension of something when it is threatened by extinction, assigning it with meaning retroactively. In such a situation, the fear of humans to bend themselves backwards for the system is not completely unimaginable. With more desperation, there is increased pressure to succumb to the processes of social subjection. Agamben is not wrong in thinking that people are having to work more for lesser wages, for under insecure conditions, for basic survival. It is oppressive and needs to be challenged, but the challenge cannot be imagined as a non-historical exit that Agamben suggests. In narrowly positing life against freedom when survival has been sequestered between viral conditions of transmission, we risk obscuring the depth and degree of the crisis we inhabit. Marx's exploration of commodity fetishism precisely highlights the self engendering process of valorization of capital, autonomization of labor, and willful automation of subjectivity through compulsive repetition of labor towards the reproduction of the system. For Marx, the commodity form of productive relations is a fetish because the socially necessary labor power that it produces becomes objectified in it. Contra Marx, Agamben gravitates towards a pre-subjective idealized abstraction of mere life, which is a presupposed whole that signifies an authentic human life. Susan Brophy demonstrates how Agamben's meaningless authenticity, and she calls it meaningless because, of course, you have the idea of the Zoe, which is something which is a pre-ideological unity of human race. So that's what she's referring to. And Agamben almost thinks that we just need to coalesce in this idea of human race, and just by rhetorical means and appeals for unity, we will be able to engender political struggle, which is which is symptomatic of idealized abstraction. So Brophy writes, Agamben's meaningless authenticity undermines the type of redemptive praxis that he seeks. In pursuit of such self-defeating ends, Agamben's ethical subject lacks any material basis upon which alienation can be effectively understood, let alone overcome. Therefore, while for Marx, the very contradiction that makes capitalism a force to reckon with and fight is its constitutive relation with capital, for Agamben, the non-status ethical community to come, in which sovereign power is overcome, remains a trans-historical ideal. He thus wants to abolish real abstraction by dissolving social contradictions into a vast emptiness of a conciliatory unity based on the ideal principle and presupposition of a non-antagonistic idea of happiness. Isabel Garrow rightly notes, Agamben's thought thus transits from ontology to ontology, occasionally ornamenting itself with allusions to a real world that is already presupposed to be fully revealed and reduced to its immanent legal logic. So when Agamben is saying that the originary biopolitical movement is the discrimination of human life and political life, which is predisposed to kind of reproduce itself transhistorically, and basically it's an exception which is going to engulf you and become the norm. So in a way, it's all this ontological paradigm is already presupposed, and then how do we organize resistance against the state? So Agamben does talk a lot about the invisible war which the virus is waging. He also talks a lot about the emergency, bare life, freedom as an ideal abstraction. But one needs to ask if life of a social and laboring person is in itself valuable outside of the coordinates of its meaning as pure phenomena, as an ideal abstraction of human life, or is it something which is always an embodied and concrete relation? uh, the transcendental matter or substance of life is it not inscribed in the social as that which is impossible to grasp and has been irrevocably severed from social life? So even if we were to understand and take Agamben's provocation seriously, that there is an ontological violence which separates the essence of human life from political life, doesn't this lost essence also animate life through inscribing itself in the social relations as something which is, impossible to grasp, and something that is irrevocably lost to, from social life? And this is something that Slavoj Žižek talks about, and that's why he juxtaposes Agamben's ontology with Marx's ontology, in which the transcendental matter is already implicated within the materiality of social relations. And of course, then he invokes Lacan and Hegel. Does life in its embodied form not get shaped by the absent presence of pneumona, inherent value of social life, which is augmented into producing social reality, which is value of human life as a juridical legal right? Therefore, the fundamental difference between Marx's ontology and Agamben's is that the former's is a transcendental ontology, while the latter's is an immanent transcendental one. Capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living power, and lives the more the labor it sucks, is something that Marx had written. The transcendental is constituent of social reality and Marx, while for Agamben it is irretrievably lost and manifests as a fatalist phenomenology of subjection. While Marx wants the very processes of uh, alienation's production to be transformed, which first and foremost alienates abstract life or mere life from itself, then manifests as an organizing principle of concrete life, which must work against itself to reproduce itself in a capitalist society. Therefore, Marx doesn't imagine a simple unity of abstract life as a pre-ideological remnant to which political life must be united, rather sees social life as shaping and altering the very structure of how we perceive and conceive pre-ideological life. So Agamben fears that the left seems to be acquiescing to the state over false alarmist concerns against people's freedom by buying into the logic of insecurity, which is designed to be countered with security solutions that would undermine security as well as compromise freedom. He says, people have habituated themselves to a permanent state of crisis that they no longer seem to realize that their lives have been reduced to a purely biological function, and have not only lost its political dimension but also any human dimension. So he's saying that people under, states of exception and emergency actually don't even realize that they've lost their elemental human dimension because they've completely surrendered themselves to this biopolitical medicalization of life. Further, he writes, thus it was possible to witness the paradox of leftist organization silence on the overarching surveillance apparatus that is being installed. He identifies duplicity in their approach, as they would, but for the pandemic, rally against the erosion of fundamental rights in any other given situation, right? So we didn't see the left forces really organizing against surveillance in a very direct fashion. But what we did see is that there were uprisings across the globe, be it in Haiti or in Venezuela and other parts of the country, where people were actually challenging the structural logic and the systematic logic of capitalism and the state, rather than directly confronting data capitalism and surveillance and isolating the security problem and then trying to address it. So, but Agamben doesn't find that satisfying. So, citing the severity of the pandemic, they seem to be accepting without any reservation limitations of the freedoms decided by ministerial decrees devoid of any legality, and which even fascism had never dreamed of being able to impose. This is a gambit. On the one hand, he is unable to resolve why people would let such restrictions be placed on themselves, losing all the hard earned freedoms of, of mobility, enterprise, and socialization to a disease. On the other hand, he is convinced of the residual expansion of the sovereign authority over life through an elaborate biopolitical surveillance regime, which the pandemic becomes a pretext for. So he does at some point say that, the pandemic is a mere pretext for data surveillance capitalism. And of course, he doesn't really use capitalism as such, but basically what he's trying to imply is that this is a totalitarian kind of a regime, which is far worse than fascism. So, Agamben's cynicism and tragic conciliation of the structural incompleteness of human life paves way for obsessive tragic mourning. While not believing in the state and wishing and waiting for its death, Agamben is petrified of confronting death of human life, which is concealed by a monstrous life of the state. So he almost starts fetishizing the state, which is that, his politics is primarily anti-statist and ontologically anarchic. So at one point, he almost tacitly supports a certain kind of reactionary populism, which instead of challenging fascism, lends support to it. Because even though Agamben keeps on talking about Zoe and human life, he can't seem to really reckon with uh, death of human life and the internal contradictions thereof. And he seems to really fetishize the state, that once the state dies, we'll all be liberated, which is not going to happen. Because where are the class contradictions going to go? Mm, He believes that one day we will be able to liberate ourselves from the state, a master he does not himself believe in, but nonetheless evokes and supports by appealing to the authority of jurists in the church. He believes that after the end of the state, we will be able to liberate ourselves, but cannot actually confront human life's own internal limitations. Master, even as a fraud, then serves as the sole source of the promise of identity fullness. And so there is an idea of like ontological completeness that Agamben wants us to return to, and which is why it is a very traditionalist form of metaphysics that he espouses. Hannah Baranchuk's paper, Neo-Fascism and the State, beautifully condenses Agamben's political position. Traumatized by the loss of the national self, brought upon by the failure of the state and by the dissolution of human life under juridicity, Agamben persistently aspires for a fortified happiness in friendship in dissident community. Agamben writes, the mass is in the grip of pseudo-religious terror, and those who have unwisely obeyed will pay the price. Agamben continues, the dissidents must think of creating something like a society within society, a community of friends and neighbors, uh, which will be a form of a new uh, clandestinity. But who are these dissidents? uh, and what is this notion of fortifying oneself in this community to come, which is going to be a community of happy dissidents who have opted out of the system? Is it going to be a vitalist left, which is then aligning with, anti-vaxxers? I mean, it's a post-ideological kind of alliance that he is imagining, where people are just going to come together and stop the machinery of the state by way of a non-historical exit, uh, which we'll talk about in a little while. He has a conception of messianic time. Uh, and despite his own intention, he ends up batting for a reified, lifeless form of bourgeois democracy. According to Nietzsche, monumental history is a cloak under which citizens' hatred of present power and greatness masquerades as an extreme admiration of the past. Antiquarian history, on the other hand, uh, assigns to those things of the past no difference in value and proportion, which would distinguish things from each other fairly. And Agamben actually does both those things. He does want to really, uh, uh, kind of attribute sovereign power, indefinite power, self expanding power to the state, almost to the point of admiring a past as being devoid of any social contradiction. So he just wants us to return to some non antagonistic political consensus, which does not exist. The discourse on securitization, in Agamben's view, then appears to be a contest between freely floating signifiers on health, medicine, biology, virology, terror, that merely attaches itself with the greed of the state and capitalists due to the imminent self maximizing logic of power. He does not consider that the ruling class will always allow security to triumph over liberty, because from the start, liberty has never been intended as a counterweight to security. It is always liberty for the sake of security, and liberty has always been security's lawyer under capitalist societies. His primary grouse is that the state, which is being invoked as the parent, patriarch, and God, is being beseeched to preserve lives by self appointing itself to discipline unruly masses. While I accept that there is a widespread reservation about appealing to fascist states and instructions to preserve democracy, and therefore there is nothing inherently socialist about demanding nationalization of resources, there is a need for nationalizing public health, but that in itself is not a guarantor of socialism. So, and this is something very specific, in terms of course, a lot of left-wing forces have been appealing for nationalization of public health, which is something that is needed at this hour. And of course, just by virtue of nationalizing the public healthcare system, you do not attain socialism. So, there's always that um, false understanding why people try to say that, okay, fine, socialism is now here just because you have better policies dictating public health. At a time when the health infrastructure globally is subsumed by capitalists, the demand for nationalization of healthcare paradoxically holds the capacity to break down the relations of inequality in social access to healthcare, and through horizontalization as well as open up ways of socializing it. So Agamben was also opposed to the idea of left-wing forces having to appeal to fascistic states, and in a way, he was thinking that this is going to further embed the state's power in society, because if you're going to nationalize resources, then the state is going to even become an all pervasive force, which I am saying is not always the case, and definitely not the case at this point. And of course, once you've nationalized and horizontalized resources, there you basically sharpen the contradictions to a point from where it can be socialized further. Therefore, when people demand accountability from the state and push it with their protest to do more for public welfare, instead of galvanizing support towards strengthening the sovereign logic, it is rather the dubious premise of protection that they are rejecting. Imposing impossible demands before the state that they're likely to fail to deliver, such protests end up raising the consciousness of people around the need for a new political economic system. It paves the way for the conditions for democratic movements to move towards building a socialist world with the restoration of democracy, not only as a passage and gateway towards socialism, but as a safeguard against sliding into fascism. When Agamben speaks of freedom, it appears that he is merely speaking of a fall of old pillars, social and symbolic organization of life worlds. However, he's also talking about the illusion of security offered by a regime which freely deploys deceit to artificially reconcile liberty and security under a state mediated variety of solutionism, capitalist solutionism. However, Agamben's protests against plutocracy are screened by a democratism which is ignorant to the basis of capitalism in society, but seems to nonetheless perceive and sense it. The class character of the state and the bourgeois interests of the church and judiciary are obscured in the fight against plutocracy. Agamben's ironic dependence on the idea of a religious church in the face of capitalist degeneration, towards which he looks with hope for maintaining the integrity of forms of life, and is disappointed by the application of this religious organization to capitalist capture, is very evident when he faults the church for lending modern science the space to replace religion, and implores jurists to act against the motion towards a totalizing regime of control that would render life to a purely vegetative form, risking complete depletion of existing modes of social bonds and forms of relations. So Agamben at some point implores jurists and the church to actually do more against modern science. So the logic that he ends up relying on is this traditional idea of authority, and he wants the church to finally, deliver its modernist rhetoric and assume power, and not let uh, these dictatorial forms of lockdown, surveillance to be implemented. Agamben argues elsewhere that the unlimited constituent power, the originary violence of the law, remains a dialectic between constituent power and constituted power, between violence that puts the juridical in place and violence that preserves it. However, this represents an aporia of law, life's inability to extricate itself from a formative violence, which engenders a society governed by law, both subject to violence of the law and subjected by law's original violence. Agamben's thought is similarly stuck in a bad infinity of aporia. Unlike the will to unearth the hidden sociality which has been oppressively suppressed and subjugated by the force of social domination exploitation, we have with us an ontological reality of sociality which is at once negatively determinate of its subjects as well as constitutively indeterminate. Both the subject and the social are incomplete, never fully interpolated, never fully complete, never internally coherent. This is an ontological predicament where the loss of a pre-ideological void never fully leaves the presence of its absence from the objective universe of subjects. It marks its radical loss deep in the core of the subjects as a loss that is ungraspable as well as impossible to realize in any positive sense. So, and this is something that Slavoj has dealt with in his work, and I'm just going to attempt at, uh, invoking it correctly. Despite knowing the limits and internal negation of law, Agamben expresses shock and dismay at how constitutionalist jurists, priests could let such a thing happen. Herein lies Agamben's formative presupposition, which assumes the state form and laws function independent of the political economy and society. And this is where he radically separates the law from its material reality. And it seems the law serves the interests of rulers, but the rulers themselves are a mere block of individual agents who are not a social class. One wonders why Agamben would implore jurists to delimit the power of the law unless he thinks of their role as neutral. He questions jurists as to why they could let people's freedoms be corrupted by surveillance and data capitalism because they are blinded by their survival instinct and willing to sacrifice anything in return for their lives to be saved. That his rationale appeals to beseech jurists to turn the law on its head and depose the constitutive violence of law renders destitute state power. So his understanding is that it is probably by appealing to the jurists that he would be able to depose the constitutive violence of the law and thus render destitute state powers. Agamben forgets how social movements and cooperatives have historically been able to repurpose the church by capturing its networks and occupying its infrastructure to run breakfast schemes, daycare programs. For example, when the Young Lords had seized the resources from the health authorities and set up city-owned tuberculosis testing centers to ensure communal health care and mutual aid. So, of course, all of these things are not even in Agamben's imagination. He reactively asserts that professors who agree, as they are doing en masse, to submit to the new dictatorship of telematics and to hold their courses online are the perfect equivalent of the university teachers in 1931 who swore allegiance to the fascist regime. Following the statement, one can infer that when he speaks of resistance, he means an abstracted will which refuses instructions by renouncing the terms and conditions for its own survival. Then, apropos of the logic of the right-wing reactionaries who fetishize radical individuality, Agamben asserts, the face is the most human of things. Humans have faces and not simply muzzles or snouts because they dwell in the open, because their faces, they expose themselves and communicate. This is why the face is the site of politics. Some may have similarly felt that they were being animalized by the domestication and by being strapped in protective gear, and that's why we saw a lot of the far-right protests. Agamben merely alludes to a new form of non-historical happy life on the horizon while actually inspecting the existent one from which the force of tomorrow will come. He obscures the basis of social relations, which is inflected with the law of value that has come to assume the hegemonic form through an abstract regime of fetishistic equivalence, which is that he actually ends up upholding equality before law and equal exchange through money uh, while actually attempting to critique it. Under capitalist mode of production, everyday life and labor is reducible to unremarked death, a killing without judgment or consequence, and without being sacrificed. So what Agamben talks about, killability without it being a sacrifice, is something which is being performed actively under capitalism. Capitalism, like all modes of production, does not merely exist within history, but actually generates its own concept of history, one which functions in tandem with the larger synchronic requirements of the system itself. Class struggle fetters society and the subject from within, and therefore the fight against the virus and capitalism can be based on a universalized struggle, but would ultimately have to be articulated from the vantage point of the revolutionary forces of society that advance and sharpen the contradictions of the class struggle towards restructuring the social order. It cannot simply be renounced. Class struggle cannot simply be renounced as a social reality. And, because Agamben did assert at some point that, people are just lured by the idea of data capitalism, and therefore they've completely surrendered. But far from that, we have seen active politics and political resistances articulating themselves through the pandemic.